Kesubos Daf Tzadi Gimel is about what happens when you have multiple wives of the same man that are all trying to collect the ksuba, but there's not enough for all of them. How do you divide it up? The daf begins with a Mishnah and ends with a Mishnah. The first Mishnah discusses what happens if they had different amounts in their ksubas. How do you prorate the property that's left to each one based on how much they're supposed to be receiving? And the second Mishnah, the one that ends off the daf, discusses if they're allowed to make each other swear, and if there's a difference in the order that their ksubas were written, can a earlier ksuba collect in an earlier time? So let's begin the Mishnah. The first Mishnah discusses three different women, three different wives of the same man. He died. They all want to collect the ksuba at the same time. Here we're not going to discuss if one of them had an earlier ksuba, so we'll assume all the ksubas had the same date, and therefore there is no priority. Neither one has precedent over the other. The only difference between the three ksubas is that they're three different amounts. One had a ksuba for 100 zuz, one had a ksuba for 200 zuz, and the third had a ksuba for 300 zuz. So the Mishnah discusses three cases. Case number one, where there was 100 zuz to be given out. Case number two, there were 200 zuz. In case number three, there were 300 zuz. How do you divide it? So the Mishnah says you prorate it, and the question is how you divide it up. So before we get to the halachos of the Mishnah, let's discuss what the Mishnah's concept is. The concept is that you split each amount of money is calculated separately based on how many people have a claim to it. So for example, in the case where you have 300 zuz, the first 100 zuz, there are three people have a claim to it, so you calculate that, how it's divided by itself. Then you talk about the next 100 zuz, which only have two people having a claim to it, because there are only two who have a claim of 200 zuz or more. And then the third set of 100 zuz, only one person has a claim to that, so that's calculated separately. So each of these is calculated separately, and that's how you decide how to prorate the money. So let's see the cases of the Mishnah. First one is clear. It's where there's only 100 zuz, all three have a claim to it. So the Mishnah says you divide it evenly, they each get 33 and a third, because the first 100, all three women have a claim to 100 zuz. The first one has 100, the second one has 200, the third one has 300, and therefore they all split it evenly. There is no prorating. They all have a claim on this money, and therefore they all are entitled to an equal share. Now, the second case is where there's a total of 200 zuz. Here, the Mishnah's halacha requires explanation by the Gemara. The Gemara will have two explanations of this in the next case. Here, the halacha is as follows. The first woman who has a claim to 100 zuz, she gets 50. The one who has a claim to 200 and the one who has a claim to 300, they each get 75. The Mishnah calls that 3 dinar zav. A dinar zav is 25 dinar kesef, and therefore 3 of them is 75. So they each get 75. 75, 75, and 50 adds up to 200, and that's how you divide it. The Gemara will explain why. Now, the third case, it was 300 zuz to divide. Here again, the first woman gets 50. This time the second one who has a ksuba of 200 gets 100, and the remaining 150 all go to the third wife who has a claim for 300 zuz in her ksuba. So now the Gemara begins. The Gemara first wants to discuss the second case. So let's break it down step by step. And here you had a man, he died, he left 200 zuz, and there are three women, 100, 200, and 300. So the first 100 of the zuz that he has, there's an equal claim to all of them, and therefore they should each get 33 and a third. And that should be all that the first woman receives. So the Gemara's question right away is, why does the first woman get 50? She shouldn't get more than 33 and a third. She should get a equal share of the first 100 zuz that's available, and she has no claim on the second 100 zuz. So the Gemara answers as follows. The Gemara answers, the second woman, the one who has a claim to 200 zuz, the case must be that she said, I'm not going to compete with the first woman on the first 100 zuz. I'm stepping out. I'm out of the first 100 zuz. I'm not involved. Therefore, the only two people who have a claim to the first 100 zuz is woman number 1 and woman number 3. The woman number 1 has a total of 100 she's asking for. Woman number 3 has a total of 300. Each way they have a claim to the first 100. Woman number 2 has removed herself. Therefore, it's two people splitting up 100. They each get 50, and that's all the first woman receives. That's why she gets 50 zuz. Okay, it says Gemara. Now let's look though at the rest of the psak over there. We said that woman number 2 and woman number 3 each get 75. Now, the explanation of that is obvious. Because there's only 150 zuz left after the first woman got 50, and there was a total of 200 to split up. There's 150 left. They each have an equal claim to the rest of it because they both had a claim to at least 200 zuz, and therefore they each get 75. The question is, though, the second woman gave up her claim on the first 100, so she shouldn't have a right to take any of the first 100. She should only have a right to split the second 100, and therefore she should only get 50. She's splitting the second 100 with the third woman. Why does she get part of the first 100 in the sense that she gets 75. That means she's taking from the first 100 that was available, she's taking half the 50 that was remaining after the first woman took 50. So again, what's happening is the first woman took 50 because she only had to split it with the third woman. Then the first 100, there was 50 left. So that's being split between woman number 2 and woman number 3. And they each get 25. Then there's another 100 left, and that's being split evenly between woman number 2 and woman number 3. Again, they each get 50 for a total of 75 each. The Gemara's kasha is that if the second woman said, I don't have any claim on the first 100, then she shouldn't get the remaining 50 after the first woman took her share. And therefore, she should only get 50, not 75. So the Gemara answers, she never removed her claim to it. She didn't give away her chelek in the first year. She said, I'm not going to compete with the first woman. She's saying, she doesn't have to divide with me as well. She only has to divide with the third woman. I'm removing my competition against her, but I'm not saying she takes my share, and I'm not saying that my share is dissolved. I still get my share. And therefore, after the first woman took her 50, I still get my share, and I still get half of it, half of what's left. Right, now this is the Gemara's first explanation. The Gemara is going to see, let's try to work through the rest of the Mishnah with this, and then we'll offer a whole nother explanation. So now the Gemara says, okay, according to this understanding that the second woman pulled out of competition for the first 100, let's try to discuss the third case. Here you had 300 zuz to be divided. Now, I understand why the first woman gets 50, because again, the second woman pulled out. Therefore, she only has to divide, it's only being divided, the first 100 is only being divided between woman number 1 and woman number 3, so they each get 50. That's clear. Now, the question is, though, what happens after that? Now, the psak in the Mishnah is that the second woman gets 100, and the third woman gets 150. So the Gemara says, let's analyze this. This doesn't make any sense. The first 100 of the 300 that we split up, that was divided between woman number 1 and woman number 3, so woman number 1 got 100. Now, of the total of 200 that the second woman has a claim to, 50 is already gone. How much is left? Only 150. So she has to split that 150 with woman number 3. So she should only get 75. How does she get 100? The entire third 100 is all going only to the third woman because no one else is competing with her on that. So how does she get more than 75? So the Gemara says therefore you have to change the answer. It's not that the second woman wrote she's not competing with the third woman. It's the third woman who wrote she's not competing. She says that she wants no part of the first 100, not with the first woman and not with the second woman. So now let's work it out. So that means that the first 100 that gets split is split between woman number 1 and woman number 2. They each get 50. Okay, that takes care of the first 100. Then you have the next 100 plus the 50. Then you have the next 100. That's 100 that is split between woman number 2 and woman number 3. Woman number 1 has no share in the second 100. So they split that evenly. They both have an equal claim in that. So woman number 2 gets another 50. So now she has 100. Woman number 3 gets her first 50. She has 50. And then the third 100 is only to woman number 3, and therefore she ends up with 150. So that's how it all works out according to this explanation that somebody wrote she wants no part in anything else. Now the Gemara says I'm going to give you a whole new explanation in all three cases. And this comes from Rabbi Yaakov from the Code in the name of Ravina. He says the case is that the property was not all available at once. It came in chunks. First, he had some property that came from the dead husband, and then there was more that was found or that he received as a payment to the orphans from somebody who owed him. It came in chunks. And it happened as follows. First, he got 75 zuz, and then the rest. So therefore, if there was, the second case where there was a total of 200 zuz to divide, that works as follows. They first had 75 zuz to divide. All three women had a claim in that 75 because they all had a ksuba of more than 75. Therefore, it's divided equally and they each get 25. Now, in the second case, there's another 125 that comes in a chunk. Of that 125, they all have a claim to at least another 75. So you take another 75, divide it up evenly. They each get 25. Now, each of them has 50. So, how much is left? There's another 50 zuz that's left to be divided. The first woman has no share in that. It's only divided between the second and the third, and that's why in the second case they each get 25 of that, so they each end up with a total of 75. And that's how we come to Upsak, that woman number 1 gets 50, and 2 and 3 each get 75. Now the third case works as follows. You had a total of 300. So the first chunk of a 75 came, was divided equally. All three women got 25. Then the next chunk came, that was 225. So the first 75 was divided evenly. They each got 25. Now each of them has 50, leaving a grand total of 150 left to be divided. Now of that 150, the first 100 is a shared claim between woman number 2 and woman number 3, because they each have only 50, so they each have a claim to that. Now, they split that evenly, so woman number 2 gets another 50, she has a total of 100. Woman number 3 gets 50, she has a total of 100. The last 50 is all that's left to go only to woman number 3, because everything else is already taken up and given out, and therefore she gets all of it herself, and she ends up with 150. So that's how all the cases work out according to this pshat. Now, the Gemara says this entire Mishnah and all its explanation of how it's divided up, prorated, based on how much the ksuba was, that's all the opinion of Rabbi Nassan in a brisa. And Rabbi disagrees, and Rabbi says no. You divide it evenly. No matter how much is available, you always divide it evenly. And that's because even if you divide it evenly, nobody's going to get more than what they deserve. Even in the case of the 300, if you divide it evenly and you give each of them 100, they each get 100, and everybody is going to get the same amount. Because even the woman who had the smallest ksuba of only 100, she has an equal shibud on all the property. All the property is mishpah to her. Therefore, she has an equal claim on all 300, just like anybody else. And therefore, she gets her 100, and everybody else gets just 100. And you don't prorate it based on the size of the ksuba. Everybody receives an equal amount in all these three cases. Now, the Mishnah had said another thing. The Mishnah said that the same halacha of division applies if you have partners who invested jointly in an investment and they're dividing the profits. You also split it based on how much they invested, prorated under the same calculation of how much of the profits they receive. The Gemara now quotes a statement of Shmuel on the topic, which seems to contradict our Mishnah. The Gemara will discuss Shmuel's halacha briefly for a while before seeing how it fits into the Mishnah itself. So Shmuel's halacha is that if you have two people that formed a partnership and they invested in the business, whatever it might be, and one invested more than the other. One invested 100 and one invested 200. So when they split the profits, or they split whatever it is they split it evenly. So Rabbah comments on this, and Rabbah says, why should they split it evenly if one invested more than the other? So Rabbah says probably what Shmuel was referring to was where there aren't specific gains that the business has. It's not that there is a profit that it increased. So for example, if it would be that they bought a cow and then the cow grew, so it gained in value, and now it's worth much more. So there, Shmuel wouldn't say you split it evenly. Why should you split it evenly? Each one invested in a different amount, and therefore the profits that are earned should be accrued, prorated to how much they invested. The case that Shmuel is referring to is where they bought something and that stayed in its value, and the question is, who should use it, or how is it given out, or how is it shared? It didn't grow. It's just the usage of it. In a case like that, they each have even usage. So if they bought an ox and they're using it for plowing, so the guy who invested 200 can't say to the guy who invested 100, I get to use it twice as much as you. That's not correct. They each are using each other's share whenever they're using it. Since they're using each other's share, they split it evenly. They're partners in it in an even amount. So now the Gemara wants to ask some kashas on this approach. Now, that's Rabbah's adjustment to what Shmuel said. Rav Hamnuna disagrees. Rav Hamnuna says, no, Shmuel said it even in a case where you have a profit that accrues, you still split it evenly. It's not prorated. So even if you had a cow that they bought to shecht and it grew and now it's worth more, they would split the growth value evenly. Each gets back his 100 and his 200, the amount that he put in, he definitely gets back. But the profits are shared evenly, 50-50, not shared in accordance with their investment. So now the Gemara asks a kasha from a brisa. The brisa says if you have two people who put money in a partnership, one 100 and one 200, they split it evenly. So the Gemara says that probably, and we'll see why the Gemara assumes this, it's referring to a case where they are slaughtering it, and it's a kasha on Rabbah because it shows that they split the gains evenly. So Gemara says no, it's talking about where it's just being used for plowing, and they're like the case that Rabbah said, they split evenly. So the Gemara says if that's true, so then the seifa of the brisa, which is looking for a case where they do prorate it, should just say that the case in which you prorated it is where you are dividing growth, because that would be the most obvious case. But it doesn't say that. It goes to a different case to show where you prorate it. Therefore, that clearly shows that this Reisha here is talking about where there is growth to divide, there's profits that you are dividing. Now, what is the case that this Brisa actually says is the Sefer where you would split it prorated. So that it says where it wasn't really a partnership. Each person brought his own stuff, and they got put together and mixed up with each other. Now you want to divide it up. So let's say one brought a cow worth 100 zuz, one brought a cow worth 200 zuz, and then they grew, and now they're worth the same. And now you're confused which one is which. So there, each one, or if you brought more cows or less cows, and now it's all in a pile and have to split it up again. So here, each one gets what they put in. There it is prorated. So again, why do we have to go to that case? Let's just talk about the case where there's growth. Obviously, the case where there's growth is the same halacha as we said in the Reisha, that is split evenly, and it's a kasha and Rabbah. So Gemara says, no, you could really reread the Brisa that it's all saying the same thing. It's saying in a case where you're using it for plowing and therefore just a question of sharing the object that they invested in, there you split it evenly. If, however, there's growth to divide, so that's as if they each brought their own thing and it got mixed up and you're dividing it, and just like there you divide it prorated, here you'll divide it prorated because each one, the part that he brought, increased in value, and therefore you're going to divide it evenly based on how you're going to divide it prorated to how much they invested in the first place. Now the Gemara says, well, how does Shmuel's halacha fit with our Mishnah? We saw in the Mishnah that it says that you divide it just like the case of the three women dividing their ksuba. We didn't say you divide it evenly, so it doesn't fit. Now, the wording of the Mishnah was if the investment went up in value or down in value, they split it like they put into it, like the case of the three women. So the Gemara says that would seem to imply that an increase or a decrease in value is prorated. Why does Shmuel say that you split it evenly? So the Gemara says, no, we're not talking about where it actually made money or lost money. We're talking about where the object itself grew in value or was devalued. So the coins, for example, the coins increased in value because they were traded for newer coins, or the coins lost value because they got rubbed out and can't be used anymore. They can only be used for whatever rubbed out coins can be used for, to put on top of a wound on your foot or something like that. And therefore each one takes his coins that he put in and it ends up not being split evenly. But if you would actually have a profit or loss, that would be prorated. That would be split evenly. We now end off with our last Mishnah, which discusses what happens when the amount of the ksuba was the same, but the order was not the same. The wives one was married before the other, and therefore has a priority claim. So the Mishnah discusses if there are four wives. A man was married to four women, and then he died, and they were not at the same time. So whoever was married first has the preceding claim. She has a right to claim fulfillment of her ksuba first, and then the second, and then the third, and then the fourth, and so on. Now, because she has priority, whatever she takes is a loss to the one who comes after her if there's not going to be enough. Therefore, she has to swear to the women who come after her that she didn't get any money in payment from her ksuba from the husband yet, because whatever she takes is a loss, is potentially a direct loss to them. Therefore, they are baldvarm. They are arguing over the money, and she can make her swear. Now, what about the last one? She's not causing a loss to anyone else. By the time she comes to collect, everybody else already has their funds. So there's a machokas if she has to swear or not. Tanakama says she doesn't have to swear anything. Menana says just because she's last doesn't mean she gets away without a shua. She also has to swear. The Gemara will explain a couple of reasons why Menanas might say that. Now, what happens if all four ksubas were written on the same day? So then if they're hours, if the time of the day is written on the ksuba, then you go by that. Like in Yerushalayim, the Mishnah says they used to write the time at which the ksuba was signed, and therefore whichever one was before the other. Now, if they all have the same time, you cannot distinguish the times based on what's written on the ksuba, then they will all have to split whatever is there evenly, because neither of them has priority over any others, at least not that they are able to prove.